Okay, I'll go ahead and get started then. So to begin with, welcome everyone and thank you for coming to the Anthropology Colloquium talk this Friday. Our speaker today is Dr. Luisa Maffi. And before I introduce her, I just want to ask you for a few things that will help the talk to go more smoothly. First of all, if you are not the speaker, please turn off your cameras so that we can preserve bandwidth. And at the end of the talk, when we get to the Q&A, if you have a question, you can just turn your camera back on to ask your question. And I also encourage you to ask any questions that you have during the talk through the chat. You can just write your question and send it through the chat there, and we will come to it at the end of the talk during the Q&A. The Q&A might go a little bit past 11 o'clock, and it probably will go quite a bit past 11 o'clock. So if you have to leave at that point, of course, that's fine, but you're welcome to stick around a little bit longer to continue the discussion. So Dr. Luisa Maffi is the co-founder and the director of Terralingua, which is an international nonprofit organization devoted to sustaining biocultural diversity, which she defines as the interconnected and interdependent diversity of life in nature, culture, and languages. Her work has pioneered and led this innovative field of knowledge and action, and has integrated research across linguistics, ecology, and anthropology, among others. And Maffi spearheads Terralingua's projects, which span research, policy, education, and on-the-ground work internationally. She also acts as editor of Terralingua's flagship publication, Langscape Magazine, which is a very clever title, I have to say. And that publication illustrates the concept of biocultural diversity through stories, poetry, photo, and video essays, and artwork from all over the world. With a background in linguistics, anthropology, and ethnobiology, Luisa has conducted fieldwork in Somalia, Mexico, China, and Japan, as well as worked with First Nations in British Columbia, Canada, where she lives. And where she is now, and apparently there's some very strong wind and some slight possibility of losing power. So if she disappears suddenly, that might be what happened. Let's cross our fingers that that's not the case. And she's written extensively on the topic of biocultural diversity, including the following books on biocultural diversity, linking language, knowledge, and the environment, which she was the editor of for the Smithsonian Institution Press in 2001. And then in 2010, together with Woodley, Biocultural Diversity Conservation, a global source book. So these are great resources for anyone interested in this topic. She's held a U.S. National Science Foundation postdoctoral fellowship at UC Berkeley and a National Research Service Award fellowship from the U.S. National Institute for Health at Northwestern University. And she was a research associate in the anthropology department at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, and a research associate in the anthropology department at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. And finally, she's an international fellow of the Explorers Club in New York. In her talk today, Dr. Maffi is going to tell us about the work she's done with Terralingua to make the study of biocultural diversity not only a tool for knowledge, but also for change. I, for one, am eager to hear about how this fascinating subject, the intersection of the natural world, human sociality, and language, is impacting the world beyond scholarly research. And I look forward to a lively debate after the talk. So thank you all for coming, and I turn it over to Dr. Maffi.
Thank you, Joshua, and thank you for that kind introduction. It is a pleasure, and welcome everyone. It is a great pleasure to be talking to you, and a special pleasure because something that Joshua didn't mention, it actually all started right there in Albuquerque, New Mexico, or at least the idea of Terralingua did back in 1995. And I will be talking about that in the first part of my presentation. Just let me know if it's time for me to start sharing screen. I'll do so, and hopefully it will all work smoothly. Okay, hopefully everybody can see my screen. Yes. Okay, so here's the title of my presentation, The Other Extinction Rebellion, Countering the Loss of Biocultural Diversity. And as I said, I'd like to give you some quick background, historical background, so to speak, at the beginning, and explain how things started in Albuquerque. But before I do that, I should backtrack a little bit more even, and talk about how things were when I was doing my studies. I have a background in linguistics, BA in linguistics from the University of Rome. I'm Italian originally. Then I went to study anthropology, and specifically linguistic anthropology and ethnobiology at the University of California at Berkeley. And I always had a natural vocation, I should say, for the natural science, for the environment and the natural sciences. But the way the landscape was, academic landscape was at that time, it was silos. Language was the object of one track, culture of another, environment of a third. And it was difficult really to cross over at that time. However, I instinctively felt that there were connections that were not being noted and explored. And so I was hearing linguists talk about endangered languages, anthropologists talk about vanishing cultures, biologists talk about biodiversity loss. And it was as if these were three separate phenomena. And I had this intuition that, in fact, there were connections between the three aspects of diversity and what was happening to each one of them. So I was revolving these ideas in my mind that biodiversity, linguistic diversity, and cultural diversity were all aspects of the diversity of life on Earth. And I felt intuitively that they were interrelated. I hadn't come up with the term biocultural diversity yet at that point. I felt that as humans evolve within specific environments, ecological niches, their languages and cultures were co-evolved and co-adapted with those ecological niches, and that traditional ecological knowledge was the expression of those adaptation, and it was in turn expressed and communicated through language. And I felt that somehow if languages and cultures are vital, that probably reflected on the vitality of ecosystems and vice versa, or if languages and cultures were endangered, that went along with ecosystem degradation and vice versa. But I really was just beginning to think of how one might go about studying such things. And that's where Albuquerque comes in. In 1995, I had just finished my PhD. I went to a symposium on language loss and public policy that was being held at university there. I don't know if anybody in the audience goes back long enough to have been there, but it was a very stimulating event, stimulating event. And I was sitting in one of the conference room listening to one of the talks, and all of a sudden, it was as if I were listening to myself talk, was someone else talking about pretty much the same things that I had been thinking about. And that was tremendously exciting. The person in question was David Harmon, a conservationist who had totally independently developed similar ideas about the connections between biodiversity, linguistic diversity, had been doing some studies about it, some comparisons of status and trends of the world's languages and the world's biodiversity. And so immediately after the talk, I essentially tackled him and said, we got to sit down and talk. And so that conversation went on with him and a few other people who had gathered around, including the late Michael Krauss, whom many of you probably well know as an eminent linguist who was behind the endangered languages movement in the early 1990s. He passed away, unfortunately, 2 years ago. We continued the conversation over dinner that night, and we came to the conclusion that there was a great need for interdisciplinary research on this topic of the connections between diversities. But we also realized that it would be, because of those silos that I showed at the beginning, it would be rather difficult to do that within an academic environment. And so literally writing on paper napkins, we hatched the idea of an organization that would bring us, that small group together, and anybody else interested, and start doing research essentially on our spare time. So that's what happened. We created Terralingua the next year and launched it in Berkeley, where I still was. With an international conference that I put together, bringing together linguists, anthropologists, biologists, indigenous persons from different parts of the world, and more, for a 3-day discussion about this topic, and to hatch a plan for research and action, because we thought from the beginning, a little bit like conservation biology, another discipline that was arising at that time, that it would be a field not only of research, but also of action, of urgent action to stem the loss of the diversity of life in nature and culture. And so initially, we indeed devoted ourselves to research, building largely at the beginning on the work that Dave Harmon had already initiated, using large databases of the world's languages and their distribution, and the distribution of biodiversity. And over time, we developed a number of maps to show this overlap. The one that you see here was created by another colleague and collaborator, Rick Steff, University of Florida. What it shows is the distribution of plant diversity as a proxy for all of biodiversity, and the colors, as you can see, show the different densities of plant diversity. And then we mapped the distribution of the world's languages as dots, which was the best we could do at the time. And so where you see the density of black dots is where there is a higher concentration of different languages around the world. And it is immediately apparent from this map that the distribution is not random. The highest density is found in tropical and equatorial areas around the world, and there are these core areas of biocultural diversity. In Mesoamerica, the Amazon basin, Central Africa, and a large area defined as Indo-Malaysia, Melanesia, including South Asia and the Pacific. That is a fact of biogeography, if you wish, and the way in which tropical and equatorial areas being rich in natural resources allow people to concentrate in smaller groups, in smaller and numerous groups, while in desert areas and higher latitudes, people have to spread out over much larger territories in order to provide for themselves. But if, of course, it has no implication for how close the links between people and the environment are anywhere. Traditional societies that are closely dependent on their natural environment are so dependent wherever they are. So this just shows how things are distributed, and shows how indeed the distribution of these two forms of diversity, where linguistic diversity stands as an imperfect proxy for cultural diversity as well, how those patterns play out around the world. And those same patterns quickly bear out also at a regional level. I chose the region where I live, the Pacific Northwest, and it shows exactly the same kind of pattern. This is one of the world's highly bioculturally diverse regions, and you see how in the southern part of this region, which is more temperate, there is a higher concentration of different languages, and it becomes more sparse as you go north toward the subpolar rainforest and tundra areas. Briefly, you know, how does this express itself at the local level in local languages? And it's spread throughout the structure and function of languages. One of the perhaps best known expressions of the link between people and environment, and the expression of the link in language, is ethnobiological classification, the way people name life forms and other aspects of the natural world. And of course, reams have been written about the depth of that traditional ethnobiological knowledge that often by far surpasses the knowledge of biologists, and those biologists who have been savvy enough have relied heavily on the ethnobiological knowledge of Indigenous communities in their studies. Other aspects of the lexicon in which that traditional knowledge is expressed is in idioms. I picked an example at random among those that in particular have been presented in Terralingua Magazine, which Joshua mentioned earlier. The 𝗭𝚻 people of South Africa have very colorful names for the parts of the day, each of which reflects some aspects, some observation of what is happening out there in nature at that particular time. And for instance, the beginning of the dawn is the falling of the glossy starling, because those birds come down from their roosts, and you see how flashy and visible they are. So it's something that really, it's a striking observation that gets connected to that part of the day. More subtly, for instance, you have connections between language and environment at the morphemic level. Numeral classifiers are one of those aspects, and for example, in Minangkabau of Indonesia, you have numerical classifiers that distinguish between objects that have particular shapes or appearances that are based in nature, seed-like or flowers or leaves with stalks, plants that grow in clumps, as you see here, one Minangkabau young man observing a bamboo grove and so forth, and that has implications for how people think and talk about things. It's all it's all expressed in these morphemes. But it goes beyond that. It really extends to discourse, to the level of discourse through myths, stories, and legends. To give you again an example from my region, the interconnection and interdependence of Coast Salish First Nations here in BC with salmon as a traditional key food source is expressed in their ancestral stories, in which essentially express the vitality of that interdependence as a transformation. Salmon are human beings that live under the sea. Periodically, they turn into salmon and come to the coast to feed people and ensure the renewal of the cycle of life. So they're treated with great reverence. And once the fish is consumed, the bones and other discarded parts are returned to the sea with great ceremony. And similarly, among Aboriginal peoples in Australia, there are stories and legends about particular animals, like this kind of grasshopper, whose name is considered the child of lightning, because it appears at the onset of rains and therefore of lightning, and signals by the turn of the season the availability of various kinds of fruits that people gather. So it really, the connection pervades all levels of language, and of course, the language expresses the cultural knowledge accumulated over time. But that's the way things are or were traditionally in Indigenous society, in local communities that were closely dependent on the natural world. But there is the dark side of the story, which is what we came to call the converging extinction crisis of the diversity of life. You all likely know about the sixth mass extinction of biodiversity. We've had 5 before, but they were not anthropogenic, they were not human caused. This one we are entirely responsible for because of our encroachment on the natural environment, extraction of resources, land use transformation, and other changes, including climate change that we have brought about. What is or was less well known when we were doing this research was that at the same time, there is also an extinction crisis of linguistic and cultural diversity. Certainly, linguists and anthropologists were talking about it, although they were not making all the connections, but the general public was not really aware of it. We felt that the same social, political, and economic pressures that were causing the loss of biodiversity were also affecting linguistic and cultural diversity. Essentially, dominant cultures and dominant worldviews were involved in both cases, and in the two, we thought the two extinction crises were connected, but we wanted to find out, and so we started another project, which was an assessment of the state and trends of the world's linguistic diversity. So we used existing catalogs of the world's languages, like Ethnologue, which has been produced repeatedly over decades. So it gives a timeline of the state of languages at different points in time. This, what you see here is just a graph that shows the picture as it was in 2010. The index is in dire need of an update, if we can only get the funding for another round. But it shows how the distribution of the world's languages is skewed. Of 7,000 languages that linguists calculate are spoken in the world today, only just 25 essentially cover half of the whole linguistic universe. The rest, what you see in gray, is all the other languages of the world. And how this plays out dynamically over time is the object of this other graph, which covers changes between 1970 and 2004 or 2005. What has been happening essentially is that those 25 so-called world languages, the most spoken, the ones with the largest number of native speakers, have been progressively increasing their presence and have been squashing the linguistic space, so to speak, of the other languages spoken in the world. This graph takes into account and adjusts for the sheer growth in population that of course has happened since the 70s, but even accounting for that, essentially those 25 languages are progressively squeezing out the others through language shift and linguistic acculturation, and that's what's essentially threatening the survival of the vast majority of the languages of the world, most of which, probably 80 to 85%, are considered to be indigenous languages spoken by indigenous societies. And then finally, what we did to test our hypothesis of the interconnectedness of these crises was to compare the global trend of linguistic diversity during that period of time to the global trend of biodiversity during the same period of time. And it was really striking to see that the two curves are very similar, and unfortunately, both on a downward trend, and would continue to do so unless, of course, we change course. And certainly, indigenous communities around the world have not been sitting on their hands about it and just seeing it happen. I wish we could find a way to compute the results of all the language revitalization, language and culture revitalization efforts, and affirmation of indigenous rights and so on and so forth. That would be a massive project that would need to be undertaken, but it's really beyond our capacity. This work called attention to a crisis, and hopefully helped awaken the confidence of the general public. And just to bring it home again for a moment, at least, bring it down to the local level, just think of the effects of climate change on words that describe states of the environment that are rapidly changing. In Denaina, the word that you see that I won't even try to pronounce because it's not one of my languages of specialty. There is a word that describes the local environment after the rain, which of course, you know, this region is a temperate rainforest. It rains a lot. Everything looks and smells fresh. The trees and every other plant is green and shiny. Everything feels renewed. The climate is getting drier and drier, especially in the summer here, and fires are becoming much more frequent and destructive. So that beautiful aspect of, and I'm sorry about this. That beautiful aspect of the environment, of the local environment that that words encapsulates may not be here in decades to come. Likewise, in Greenland, there is a word that describes a specific condition of the wind when people go out into a fjord, in a specific relationship between sea and frozen land. The wind comes from the fjord, can make it hard to find one's way back home, but as soon as one is out, the weather is good and all is well. These are words that really describe vital aspects of life in that region, and that too may soon be changing as climate change transforms that area, and ice rapidly melts. And again, to bring it even closer to home, things that we may be much more familiar with as English speakers. This is a study that two colleagues of mine did, and it's actually published in the book that came out of the 1996 inaugural conference of Terralingua. Philip Wolf and Doug Medin studied the devolution of ethnobiological lexicon by using a large corpus of text in the English language between the 1400s and 1900s, and identified this progressive loss of specificity in the naming of trees during that period of time. So in earlier texts, the trees were referred to with their very specific names, for instance, a type of oak. And then over time, the references became more generic, just oak, and even more generic, like tree. And so there were suggesting that the trend might continue toward not even identifying a natural feature as a tree, but just as a plant, and one has to wonder as we become more and more immersed in our virtual world on our smartphones, what may be coming next, that thing. And if you think that that's far-fetched, look at this. I don't know how many of you heard back in 2007 that the lexicographers of the Oxford Junior Dictionary, which is the student version of the Oxford Dictionary, were considering replacing the definition of BlackBerry from the thing you see on the left from the thing you see on the right, on account of the fact that students might be much more familiar with with the thing on the right than the one on the left. It caused such an uproar that they quickly abandoned the idea. But it shows that it wasn't really far-fetched to imagine that references to aspects of the natural world may be disappearing faster than we think. This cartoon really encapsulates why, in our virtual world in which we are immersed, and in which children are immersed more and more. The connection with nature is becoming more tenuous. The awareness that we are part of it is less strong, if is still present at all. And some child psychologists have even started thinking that there may be such a thing as nature deficit syndrome. So the reflections of that loss of contact with the natural world are profound, and certainly a contribution to the loss of biocultural diversity. After doing that kind of research and coming to that conclusion, we really decided that it was essential to not just focus on pointing to the downward slide, but to try to do something about countering that trend. And so our projects started concentrating on the conservation or maintenance aspect of the equation. We did a project surveying work being done by others around the world from a biocultural conservation perspective. That is on the ground projects that really sought to combine the conservation of the natural world with the maintenance and revitalization of traditional knowledge, in some cases even explicitly local languages. And the result was the book that you see, which Joshua mentioned in the introduction. It's a presentation of all those case studies and an analysis of them, with recommendations, again, for both on-the-ground work and policy at the international level. Based on that piece of work, we also created a volume of a little toolkit that we have, and which is available for anybody interested on our website, which introduces the concept of biocultural diversity in various aspects of measuring and monitoring the state of languages and traditional knowledge, documentation of languages and traditional knowledge, and again, biocultural approaches to conservation. So that's available for everyone interested. We also started doing projects in collaboration with Indigenous communities, supporting some of their own projects and interests, and particularly because we are located here in British Columbia, working with First Nations, the 𝗤𝗍 people who are Coast Salish, who are our most immediate neighbors. They have a very active language and cultural revitalization program led by their elders and remaining fluent speakers. So over time, we did a variety of projects with them, including what you see in the upper right, the preparation of storybooks with some of their traditional stories transcribed and illustrated by the language apprentices. Is a very active group of language apprentices who are adult learners who acquire fluency that they didn't have as children and then become the next teachers of the following generation. And on the lower right is a language retreat that they had a few years ago that Terralingua helped support, in which they established their plan for the following decade of work, and this collaboration is still ongoing. Likewise, we worked with another First Nation in the interior of British Columbia, the 𝗖𝗄𝗏 people who are Athabascan. For them, at the time, there was a pressing need to protect their land, and particularly the lake that you see at the bottom center, Fish Lake, which a mining project would have transformed into, a mining project would have been established just in the vicinity of this lake, devastating the pristine landscape, transforming this pristine lake into tailing ponds for the mine. So what they wanted to do was to document their presence on the land and the traditional knowledge of their elders about this place, as a way to support their claim with the Canadian government that the project shouldn't proceed. So we supported that documentation, and I am happy to say that although the mining company is still making a lot of noise, the project has been stopped and has not proceeded so far, has been in essence killed by 2 environmental reviews that asserted the irreparable damage to the natural environment and to the way of life of the 𝗖𝗄𝗏. At the same time, we also realize, you have to work at both ends of the spectrum. On the one hand, with local communities who are on the forefront, so to speak, and at the other end, on educating the general public about the importance of biocultural diversity. And that's where our magazine came in. It originally was just a simple newsletter, but little by little we transformed it into a proper magazine with stories that come in from all over the world, and through which we seek to make the voices of diverse peoples heard, which are usually very underrepresented. And people tell their own stories, so it's very different from, say, National Geographic, which parachutes their journalists in places. These are story told from the very mouths of the people who live those situations. And that's, through the magazine, we've been taking an increasingly active role in really advocating for biocultural diversity. You all know, of course, about the Extinction Rebellion movement against climate change, which of course has been very, very effective in raising awareness of that threat, but we felt that there were a few things missing from that movement. For instance, you see it clearly in this picture. If you look, I don't see a single non-white face. And of course, climate change is not the only emergency that we are facing. And here's what's missing, you know, the voices of diversity and the awareness of the links between people and the land, let alone that there is a converging extinction crisis of diversity, nature, and culture. Even if we, by miracle, solve the climate change problem tomorrow, we would still have this other massive crisis to deal with. And here are Indigenous youth from British Columbia sitting peacefully occupying basically the steps of our provincial legislature as a making statement against the building of pipelines that would be put through their territories. And that banner there really gave me goosebumps. They stole the children from the land, referring of course to residential schools. Now they steal the land from the children. And I thought these youth really have it. And they were so articulate and so eloquent. That really gives us the idea that we should also try to get the voices of Indigenous youth into the magazine. And that's what we did in 2019, which was the International Year of Indigenous Languages. We created this project for that purpose. It now continues, the Indigenous Youth Storytellers Circle, and we invited stories from youth from all over the world. And I won't take the time to read all of these quotes, but you can see for yourself that if we called this issue of the magazine Restoring Biocultural Diversity Wisdom from Young Indigenous Leaders, we didn't use that word wisdom randomly. It is absolutely breathtaking what kind of awareness all these youth expressed about being the link between the past and the future, and that link, that biocultural link, needed to be maintained and not forgotten as Indigenous peoples move forward. And so building further on that, the next and current issue of the magazine, we just decided to get even bolder and really put out this idea of the biocultural extinction rebellion as the other extinction rebellion that we need. And we did this issue last year in the middle of the pandemic, and we weren't even sure whether anything would happen at all. We were astonished by the number and the quality of contribution by Indigenous and non-Indigenous persons on this topic, men, women, youth, stories about how Indigenous communities responded to the pandemic, stories about responses to the other pandemic that exploded at the same time, of systemic against rebellion against systemic racism, and it goes on and on. And here are just a flavor of what stories people told. It goes from Kenya, where the elders were reviving ancient rituals to help strengthen community cohesion and thereby stave off the threat of the pandemic, to Native Hawaiians who are taking a stand near their sacred mountain against a 10-meter telescope, to youth who are learning participatory video techniques here, Guajajara youth in Brazil and Inuit youth in the Northwest Territories of Canada, to tell their own stories, whether it is about traditional knowledge and their ancestral ceremonies, or in the case of the Inuit youth, their stories about the communities are being affected by climate change. And there were a particularly rebellious group contributed from Borneo, Indonesia, an island that has been long under assault by logging, mining, industrial agriculture, and so on. And local communities are really responding actively by asserting their connection to the land, their tradition, their traditional forms of shifting agriculture, and they are really undeterred. The last story in this issue of the magazine, and the one that I want to leave you with, it comes from Colombia, from the Sierra Madre de Santa Marta in coastal Colombia, a region that had for a long time remained isolated, in which indigenous communities had kept themselves isolated, but it's now in turn being assaulted by logging, mining, industrial agriculture, and so on, and even by COVID-19. The person you see in this picture, the one on the left, is a Mamo, a wise man from the Kogi people, Jose dos Santos 𝗪𝗓𝗪𝗔𝗍, and he died of COVID in August 2020. I couldn't believe that COVID could get there too, but it did. And another Mamo, there's a quote in this story that I wanted to leave you with. He said, "Why do we want to damage the earth and water? Let's change our lives, sow new seeds." And that really is a lesson for us to reflect on as we come out of the COVID pandemic, as we consider the world as it might be after that. You know, we hear a lot about build back better and similar slogans. There is no way in my mind that we can build back better unless we consider what we are, how we are transforming the planet, how we are affecting the diversity of peoples around the world, including the diversity of knowledge that there are other ways to live, other ways to relate to one another and to the natural world. So that's where I think the biocultural Extinction Rebellion comes in, to remind us that to build back better, we need to rebuild and re-strengthen the diversity of life in nature and culture. And I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk, Dr. Maffi. We have time for questions now, so please, if you have a question for Dr. Maffi, please, you can just unmute your video and your audio and go ahead and ask. We don't have any questions in the chat, so we can handle it that way. Hi, Chris. Oh, you need to unmute audio. We can't hear you.
Yes, good afternoon or good morning.
Hi.
I met you in 1995 under N. Romanovsky's class.
Oh, yes. Hi.
You might remember us. Well, anyway, we too here in the Southwest, I'm studying Native American languages.
Yes.
And also I produced a thesis about our language loss here on my reservation. And back in the 60s, I was studying linguistics in USC, and we were trying to connect with native languages and corn. And recently, while I was here at UNM, I connected those three together. So I'm following in your footsteps. And thank you very much for this presentation.
Well, thank you so much. It's lovely to know that you were there way back when, and that somehow your path has gone in a similar direction. Really, really glad to hear. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Thanks. Is there another question? Let's see. Ian, yeah.
Hi there, that was a really fascinating talk. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it, and it was very thought-provoking. I want to ask a question, and I don't really know actually how to phrase it. So this might be a little clumsy. But I'm curious about do you think it's difficult in some parts of the world to both preserve, I guess, cultural heritage or cultural language being part of that, and at the same time prepare oneself to actually be effective in sort of a political realm to address environmental damage or something like that? It almost seems to me that paradoxically one needs to sort of become part of a certain world in order to like fight within that world. And I just wonder like about that tension.
Yeah. That's an excellent point. Indeed, I think that, and I don't claim to speak for Indigenous peoples or Indigenous communities in any way, shape, or form, but based on my 25 years of observations, I would say that Indigenous peoples and local communities as well have been very well aware of that tension, and it's definitely not an either or, and many Indigenous communities have been very savvy about that. Many of the younger people, and you saw the quotes from some of those youth whose stories we carried in the magazine, express that very point. We need to move toward the future, but we need to do that in a way that doesn't cut us off from our past, because the past is who we are. And that loss of identity has been the crux of the loss of biocultural diversity, essentially, where people don't know who they are anymore and where they come from. That's when cultural change, linguistic change, as well as the encroachment on people's lands can more easily happen. So it is a tall order, and it is a challenge, but I think that Indigenous communities are very well aware. Youth are getting educations, of course, largely in the dominant educational system, but very much with an eye to then using what they learned and their ability to mediate between different worlds to help and support their communities, their rights, their efforts to maintain and revitalize their languages and cultures, and so on and so forth. And an example that I know really well directly is the one of the 𝗤𝗵𝗃𝗃 people, the Coast Salish people that we work with, and I showed some slides of it. Their language apprentices are just astonishing in their commitment. You know, they could be doing something else. They could certainly be out there making a lot more money if they chose different careers, but no. That's what they want to do, and they apprentice themselves. Some of them take courses at, say, the University of Victoria here in BC, or University of British Columbia, and then they go back to the community and use that knowledge to contribute to the language maintenance and revitalization programs, and they are extraordinarily committed. So, of course, that's just one outcome. There are many other outcomes from the unfortunate effects of that, of acculturation and negation of indigenous identity, which can have profound effects in terms of social maladaptation, to indigenous peoples deciding to abandon their or ignore their identity. But I sense that there is more and more a movement toward both putting your grounds firmly in the contemporary world, and using whatever you know and whatever you learn to strengthen and rebuild the identity and the way of life of indigenous communities. So it's a challenge, but I think it's happening.
Thank you. That was again, that was a really fantastic talk. I'll just note, I'm thankful that somebody has a word for the sensory experience after it rains. That is definitely something that there could be a word for. So I'm happy to learn that. But thank you very much. It was a great talk.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question, Ian. Do we have some more questions? Well, I have a bunch of questions, probably more than are reasonable to ask right now. So I'll just ask two. The first one is, I was curious, as you talk about the connection between linguistic diversity and environmental change and biological diversity. If you, setting aside the ecological effects of language shift, for example, what else you think is sort of at stake in the loss of linguistic diversity? What's really what's lost when, as those 7,000 or however many languages get more and more dominated by a small number, and also if you think that environmental change could drive language change, or if it's only in the opposite direction.
Well,
I also had a question about conservation.
I'll answer your second question first. And yes, it definitely goes both ways. On the one hand, environmental change can essentially make certain aspects of traditional knowledge and their expression in language obsolete. If you don't have your forests anymore because it has been mowed down, obviously the knowledge and the language related to that particular aspect are not applicable anymore, and may over even a relatively short period of time become obsolete. On the other hand, if language changes, and especially if there is shift from an indigenous language to a majority language, the way the way of life and the way of thinking of human relationships with the natural world may vanish with the vanishing of the language, and that can be one factor, certainly not the only factor in a shift in how the local environment is treated. If you go from a language that is so enmeshed with the local ecology to a language that does not contain or express any of those connections. Obviously, those connections may be lost. An example that comes to mind here is when I was doing my doctoral research, I was working with contemporary Mayan communities in southern Mexico, in Chiapas, Tzeltal Maya communities. And the topic of my thesis was medicinal knowledge, ethnomedical knowledge, how people identified signs and symptoms of illness and expressed them in their language. So a very typical linguistic anthropological topic. As a part of that, I was also gathering information about, what people use, what plants and other remedies people might use for those health conditions that they identified in their medical system. And there were lots of names of plants in Tzeltal Maya that came up that way. And I was working with a Mayan collaborator who acted as the transcriber and translator of all the tapes that I was recording. And he was fluent in Spanish, but he was getting very frustrated because he thought that his Spanish wasn't good enough, because he didn't know how to translate the name of the majority of those plants. And I had to convince him that it wasn't his fault. It was the fact that Spanish just didn't have names for those. So a shift from Tzeltal Maya to Spanish had an implication, a huge implication, about the maintenance of traditional ethnobiological knowledge, and in this particular case, also of traditional ethnomedical knowledge. So that's the kind of loss that happens when language shifts. So it definitely goes both ways. In terms of what else is lost other than the awareness and the knowledge of our connection with the natural world, there's a lot more. Of course, all aspects of culture are reflected in language, as we all know, if we are linguistic anthropologists, and that's really what we are concerned with. So knowledge about the environment and how to also act in and behave towards the environment is only one aspect of the whole picture, although a mildly important one, because of course, no matter what we think, we're still entirely dependent on a healthy environment to be alive and healthy ourselves. But all other aspects of culture, including our ways, our spirituality, our ways of expressing our relationship with the larger cosmos. There's also human rights implications that are certainly very much enshrined in the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which include, in a sense, it's a biocultural declaration of rights, because it really covers all aspects of language, culture, and environment, or, in the language of that declaration, land and land rights. But all of that obviously is part of the picture, and so rights to language and rights to culture are definitely another aspect that the loss of biocultural diversity affects. So there's a rights issue. And finally, I would say it's really something about our humanity. The way, if you wish, the way life has evolved on the planet has for millennia and indeed hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years of human presence, been a trend toward diversification in nature and the diversification in human societies. In a way, we haven't diverges into different species biologically, but we have created our own cultural species, if you wish, and the trend has been toward diversification there too. So in a way, it's almost like we're having an implosion of that diversity, of that trend toward this diverse flourishing of life. And with that negative trend also comes a loss of worldviews, of diversity of worldviews, many, if not most of which have been much more sustainable than the dominant worldview that we are increasingly converging towards. So if we want to confront these crises, the climate change crisis and all of the other global crises, including the loss of biodiversity, et cetera, that we are facing today, countering the loss of diversity in nature, in languages and cultures, has to be part of the picture, because that's where those other worldviews are enshrined, those other ways of saying I am human are enshrined, and it would be an incalculable loss to lose those. It would be part of this self-destructive trend. It would accelerate that self-destructive trend that we are on to today.
Thank you. Yeah, it's fascinating how and kind of scary how intermingled, you know, in the first part of your answer, the environmental and linguistic change are. And it seems like as, you know, environments, you know, get destroyed, or you know, access is cut off from groups of people that are, you know, accustomed to interacting with and, you know, engaging with, you know, socially, medically, linguistically with those landscapes, that it impacts the language, and then that further, you know, makes it more difficult to access, whether it's through legal channels trying to prove, you know, prove identity or you know, some kind of authority or right to use those landscapes, like happens in many cases as well. So it seems like a kind of vicious circle. So your work is, you know, very important to have all these examples out there to show how that happens. Thank you for that. Do we have more questions? Okay, well, I could keep talking with you about this, but I will. Oh, Ian, did you have another question? Oh, okay, yeah. So yeah, thank you again for a fantastic and wonderful talk, and please, I encourage everyone to go to check out Terralingua's website and their publications and learn more about this. There's a lot of good resources for teaching as well that you can get here. And so, yeah, thank you very much. Let's have
Thank you.
Otherwise.
Thank you all. And as I understand it, there will be a YouTube being made available. Would you mind letting me know, Joshua, when it's on, so I can share that with our network?
Yes.
Thank you, Joshua, for the invitation. Thank you all for being here, and hopefully there will be an opportunity in the not too distant future to actually come back to Albuquerque and meet everybody in person. But thank you so much again.
Thank you. Take care. Goodbye, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Bye.
Bye.